So our next presentation addresses a furry companion that is found in 41% of households across the country. Sze-Wing is a recently recruited postdoc in the Wildlife Ecology and Management team, and she specialises in behavioural ecology with a focus on understanding predator-prey dynamics and its practical application in conservation. While her talk today focuses on the smaller felines, she previously studied behavioural interactions of lions and their prey in South Africa. Today, Sze-Wing will discuss her current project that explores non-lethal control methods for cats by manipulating their behaviour using fear. Welcome, Sze-Wing.
Tēnā koutou katoa. It's nice to see everyone in person. Let me open my presentation here. Unfortunately, we don't have any lions in New Zealand, so I will talk about cats today. So the cat project is led by Patrick Garvey, our senior scientist in the team. And we are working in collaboration with Justin Zerasi, a lead scientist from the Conservation Science Partner in California. As we all know, Aotearoa is a very cat-loving country. As Sam mentioned, we have over 40% of Kiwi households that have at least one cat, which translates into 1.7 cats per house. And we have a culture of allowing our cats outdoor to explore wherever they would like. So they have the freedom, have the mental stimulation as well. And unfortunately, while they're roaming the outdoor, we also know that they actually face many different risks. So they fight with other cats. And when I was working up in Auckland, I have a friend who has a cat who are busy fighting with possums during the night and sustain actually injuries from that. So injuries can result in infections, and these interactions with other species can also result in transmission of diseases. For example, for feline HIV, being outdoor is actually identified as one of the most important risk factors for transmission of this disease. When we also know that you might have heard of a disease called toxoplasmosis, which is parasitic, and it can be transmitted from rodents to cats and eventually transmitted to humans as well. And at the same time, when they're wandering around, they also goes into dangerous places, crossing highways, and sometimes also have the dangerous places like construction sites. And there was a study in Canada that actually found that for all of the cats that have been brought into vet clinics, more than 39% that results in sudden death was because of trauma. And among those cases, more than 80% are actually resulted from traffic injuries. So while they explore the outdoors, unfortunately, we also know that they are very good predators. So they do have negative impacts on our native biodiversity, which unfortunately creates a conflict between the conservationist and the cat lover. So in New Zealand, at the moment, we don't have any national legislation on cat management issues. And different social research also shows that cat owners are not very likely to support any legislation, and even less that would support any advocation for cat containment. So our project is specifically trying to look for a middle ground. If it's possible for us to actually understand more about domestic cat behavior and potentially manipulate that behavior, possibly using sounds that represent a risk to these cats, to potentially apply this knowledge on protecting the cats outdoor from the risk that they're facing, while at the same time also protect areas in urban environments where there is high biodiversity values. So the scientific theory behind the whole project: in a natural environment, predator would affect their prey directly through eating them, predation. But at the same time, they actually also have an indirect effect on their prey by changing their behavior. So the prey needs to avoid being eaten. So by doing that, they would change a series of different behaviors. For example, they might move into different areas where predation risk is lower, and they might change their movement rates, and they might spend less time feeding in areas that are risky and being more alert in areas where it's that being more alert in areas with high risk area. And sometimes they might even change in their breeding patterns. So in the urban landscape recently, there are lots of research that have shown that predators, humans and dogs actually represent the predators in an urban landscape. And our collaborators, very interestingly, in the US, have tried to use broadcasting of humans talking sounds and dogs barking sounds to see if it creates a risky area. And he found that the sounds from humans and dogs actually would reduce the amount of time spent feeding for raccoons and pumas in urban area. And they also found that the pumas actually moved completely away from the areas where the sounds were broadcasted. I keep forgetting to press the button. I'm very sorry about it. So applying the same concept, we are trying to see if we can use it actually in New Zealand and see if we can actually change the behavior of cats in urban areas. So our project specifically have two different phases. So the first phase was a behavioral trial that we have already completed. And the objective of the behavioral trial is to understand the behavior of cats in response to the sounds that represent risk. And in this proof of concept study, we were focusing on feral cats. So we captured cats from feral populations and to see how they respond behaviorally to sounds. And the different type of sounds that we tried is dog barking, humans talking, which already proved that it works in the US. And we also throw into a sound which is aggressive cat growling, because it might also represent the risk to the cats, territorial conflicts. And at the same time, we also test the response to cricket sounds, which acts as a control. It is supposed to be non-risky. So it allows us to prove whether it's actually the type of sounds that is making a difference or just the presence of a random weird sounds. So the second phase of the study would be a field trial based on what we have learned in the behavioral trial. Then we will be using these risky sounds in urban reserves, try to create an area that is high risk and see if we can change the behavior of domestic cats and maybe redirect their movements. Yeah, I hope you remember what I've just said. Yeah, so today I will be focusing more on what we have found in behavioral trials, the results, and also explain a little bit on what we are planning to do with the field trial. So for the behavioral trial, it was conducted in a very large enclosure that is 1 hectare in size. So we try to mimic a natural environment in this enclosure by putting foot patches in this in the 4 different corners. So the red dots represent the foot patches. So at the corner, it looks exactly like this. There is 25 grams of chicken mince in front of a trail camera. Again, in front of the camera. And it looks exactly the same for all of the 4 corners in the enclosure. And the cameras is connected to a pair of speakers. It's a relatively new technology. It took us quite a few attempts to make it work. There's some casualties of the trail cameras and also almost blowing up our office to make it work. So how it works is when the camera is triggered, then the speakers would play the sounds, and we can actually program what kind of sounds that the speakers play, how long it plays, when it plays. So the speakers, we hide it in the bush rack, so as to avoid the cats from associating these sounds with the camera. So the sounds would come from different directions instead. And at the same time, you see a lot of the camera symbols in the enclosure as well. It was because we set back-to-back facing cameras to surround an area of 15 square meters, so we can monitor the cat's movements into and out of the areas and compare the time spent in the different areas where sound were played, which are supposed to be a risky area, and the other 3 corners where the sounds are not played, which is supposed to be non-risky area. So the whole trial runs like this. The cat is released in the center spot where we have an area where they can sleep, and the cats are allowed to explore the entire enclosure for 2 days. They can find the 4 meat patches at the 4 different corners. And after these 2 days, then we start the experiment. And every single night, we would pick a corner where the sounds are played. As I mentioned, there are 4 different types of sounds: the cricket sounds, the human sounds, the dog sounds, and the cat growling sounds. So every night we pick one corner to play the sounds, and not a single corner would be selected twice. So basically, every night there is one corner that is very risky and 3 corners that is non-risky. And we look at how the cat responds basically to the sounds and in different areas. And some of the interesting results, we have run basically 22 cats in total, 16 males and 6 females. Yes, 16 males and 6 females. Oh my God, graphs, but it's actually not very difficult to understand. So the first thing we looked at is fleeing behavior, which is defined as the cat running away when the sound is played. So the graph basically shows the probability of the cats in running away when the different type of sounds are played. So we can see from the graph that the human sounds, they have the highest chance of running away, followed by the cat growling sounds, dog barking sound, and lastly, the cricket sound. So it seems that the cat sound, dog sounds, and human sounds are all making an effect on the cats. And we also, secondly, we looked into the number of exposure, and we found that there is also a significant effect on the cat behavior. So because the cat is in the enclosure and they can actually visit certain corners multiple times during the same night. So we looked into whether the number of exposure, so basically the number of times that they visit the cameras and being with the sounds played, would it actually influence their probability in running away as well? And we do find that it seems there is an effect of habituation, where when they are being exposed, the number of exposure increases, then they are less likely to run away. This is a prediction graph, so it's not like a cat is being exposed to the same sound like 40 or 60 times. It's not like that, but it's just modeling results based on the results we got. So there seems to be habituation. And this is just an example of showing how the cat responds to the cricket sounds. Hope it works. So the cat come, start feeding on the mince, and at 10 seconds, wait for 10 seconds. Yeah, there's the cricket sounds is played, and then it decided, okay, I've heard the sounds and it's not risky, so I'll just continue feeding. Meat is nice, life is good. And this is another example where there's human talking sounds. It's a bit windy, so it's quite loud. So the cat come in, I can smell something. Oh, I'm going to walk towards the meat. There's meat. And it plays, and so I'm gonna go. Is high risk area. I'm scared. I'm gonna go. So it works very perfectly, actually. And this is just one of the examples. And we also looked into actually how many times they would return to the corners where the sounds were played. Looks complicated again, but not very difficult to understand. So as I mentioned, every night there's one corners where sounds were played and the other 3 corners with no sounds. So the corners with no sounds are represented by all the 4 bars on the top where there is a cross on the icons. So you can clearly see that the patterns is all of the corners with no sounds played, the number of times of returning for the cats is much, much higher compared to any corners with whatever sounds is played. While when we look more specifically towards corners where sounds were played, which are the 4 bars at the below, and we found statistically that humans talking sounds and cat growling sounds actually have a lower numbers of times returning compared to the cricket sounds. So it seems humans talking and cricket sounds is more effective than dogs in this case. We then also looked into how much time they would take actually before they return to the same area. And again, we saw a pattern of habituation where when they have a higher number of exposure to the sounds, then the time taken for them to return to the area actually shortened. And lastly, this is very interesting. We also look into their total time spent feeding at the corners, and it shows again a very clear pattern where all of the four corners on the top with the cross where sounds were not played, they spend much longer time on feeding compared to the area where sounds were played, the y-axis in log scales in seconds. While when we look specifically at the corners where sounds were played, and we found that statistically, for the corners where human sounds were played, they spend less time feeding compared to the cricket sounds, while for the cat growling and dogs barking, it doesn't seem to make a very significant difference compared to the cricket control, where it's not risky. So basically, in summary, for all of these results, we found that the patterns is human sound seems to have the riskier effects on the cats, followed by cat growling sounds, which is kind of also as expected because territorial conflicts are likely to be a more significant risk compared to dogs barking when dogs are usually controlled by the owners, but the cats would actually physically fight with each other. So human sounds also seems to be very promising. So now, as I mentioned, this whole behavioral trial was running on feral cats. So the second question is, how does it work on domestic cats? Would they actually respond the same way? So the second part of phase 1, we actually conducted a trial on people's garden in the middle of Christchurch City. So we have a similar setting in the city where in each garden, we set 2 different camera traps. And this time we are not camouflaging the speakers, but the speakers are actually tied directly with the cameras. And we also put a lure in front of the cameras to try to get the cat in front of the view of the camera. And the lure was soaked in fish oil. And to be honest, it didn't work very well. And one of the reasons is probably domestic cats are usually very well fed. So as a food lure, then they might not be very interested. But I found that the hedgehog is a significant problem in people's garden because I got so many videos of hedgehog instead of cats. So the whole experiment runs like this, is a total of 3 weeks time. The first week, we did not play any sound at all, just to collect normal cat behavior. The second week, we play either the cricket sounds or the human sounds. We chose human sounds, because it was identified as the most significant sounds from the behavioral trial. And the last week, we played humans or cricket, depending on what was played on the second week. And we look into cat activities and also how they respond to the sound. And I don't have, So we tested in 6 gardens so far. And within these 6 gardens, we already have more than 30 cats exposed to the sounds. And on average, actually, every garden have at least 6, 7 different cats that we recorded. And I don't have much time to explain all the results, but again, the most important one is whether they run away or not. And again, we see the same patterns as in the garden trial where the humans talking sounds actually generate an effect, much higher effects compared to the cricket sounds play. So great, awesome. Everything looks actually really good. Same patterns, behavioral trial for the feral cats and also for the domestic cats. So again, just want to show another example that is recorded in people's garden. This is an example of cricket sounds. The cricket sounds play, the cat, oh, I hear the sound. It's so interesting. I'm going to check it out. So I have actually a lot of videos of the cat checking out the cameras. They're not scared at all. So it's not risky. Basically, cricket sound is just interesting sounds. And another example is how humans talking works. So it plays. Let's hear the sound. Nope, I'm going to go. So you can see that the pattern is very similar to what we found in all the behavioral trials and before. So great, it seems to work. And now we actually need to test if it actually works. This concept actually works in the field. So in the coming 2 months, we will be working in some urban reserves in the 3 biggest cities in Aotearoa, Auckland, Wellington, and Christchurch. We have sites in all these 3 different cities. And in these reserves, we will be setting the same technologies, the motion tracker cameras and the speakers. And this time we will be running the field trial much longer for a 4-month period of time. For the first month, we do not play any sounds, so to collect normal cat behavior in order to compare it to the 3 different sounds that we are going to play, which includes the humans talking sounds, the cricket sounds, and also the cat growling sounds. So the order of play for the human, cricket, and cat sounds will be randomized among the different study areas, so we can take away the effects of maybe the order of sounds playing could make an effect on how the cat responds. And lastly, we would also be tracking domestic cats as well to understand their movement and space use pattern in the landscape. This is a cat from my colleague, and we try to put the harness on the cat, and the harness actually have a GPS logger attached, so it collects the GPS location of the cat every 5 minutes. This is the same technique that have been used on an international study that was conducted in both UK, US, Australia, and New Zealand as well. They use also cat harness and GPS loggers, and they tracked over 900 different cats. There's also actually a very interesting studies going on in Dunedin at the moment, where using the same techniques, they're trying to assess cat behavior and compare it between areas where there are rat controls and areas without rat controls. So hopefully, if we do the same in our project, we can add in our knowledge to understand better how domestic cat moves around and what is actually their behavioral responses to risk in the landscape. I just want to take this chance to thank my colleagues in the wildlife ecology and management team, especially our technicians, because they are our avengers, our backbones. Without them, nothing would ever be done. So thanks very much. And I also want to thank Auckland Council, Christchurch City Councils, and also Wellington City Council for supporting our field study. So any questions are welcome. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I was curious about the beginning of your talk, how you said that less than 1% of cat owners would support cat containment. And I was wondering whether education was looked at a factor in that, and whether, that education could potentially change that number.
From what I remember, they did not that study did not specifically look into whether it's because of related to education, but it's just a general survey done actually on people in vet clinics, basically people, cat owners that goes into certain vet clinics. So they do a quick survey to see how would they support different management strategies. So no, they did not do the education part, but yeah, definitely. I think public education should be a big component in our Te Aroa for responsible cat ownerships.
Why did you choose dog barking versus a dog growling? Because a bark is a warning, whereas growling is an indication of attack. And also, if you're going to use this outside, barking is a lot noisier than a growling sound.
Yes. So dog barkings was chosen mostly actually based on what we already know from studies already conducted. So we know that it works. But you're right, like growling could be potentially one of the sounds that we can try. And we also were thinking about potential disturbances to people as well. So at the end, actually great that for the behavioral trial, we found that the dog's barking actually does not work as effective as cat growling actually and the human sounds. So in that case, we are not going to use that sounds for field trial, and we don't have to risk of setting off every single dog in the neighborhood during the night. Otherwise, we'll get a lot of police calls, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering, you probably looked at this, but in terms of frequencies of the sound, how different are cat ears and hearing to the speakers? Because I would expect that most speakers are made with humans in mind. So they're attuned to the frequencies that the human ears are most perceptive. I don't know if I'm using the right words, but yeah, how differently cats hear, and if that could be also like a thing to consider for example, why the dog barks didn't work as well.
Well, indeed, cats have a different hearing range than human beings. They are able to hear higher frequency sounds. So I think there was some research that was done in actually just looking at high frequency sounds where cat would respond with that human cannot hear certain type of sounds, and they do respond to that. But in our study, because the theory is actually based on the predator-prey interaction, so we want to be realistic where the predator sounds that we test actually have to match what the real world expectation is. So for the sound level, we are actually using again, actually based on what is proven that works. So in our experiments, it was played at 80 decibels at 1 meters from the speakers, which actually technically it might not be realistic, but it was tested as effective before. And we can see that the cat responds to the different type of sounds differently. So we assume that it kind of represents what is happening in reality so far.